Hello out there world. Okay, so I know at least a few. How many of you in the room were at Joan's talk yesterday? A handful of you. Okay, so maybe what we might start with, if you're okay with it, is if you want to just kind of summarize for anybody who wasn't there. But before you even do that, let me introduce you. So for those of you who weren't there yesterday, you didn't get to hear my amazing introduction of Joan. So Dr. Joan Walker is the T.Y. and Margaret Lin Professor of Engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, where she also currently serves as the chair of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Her research focuses on travel behavior and data analytics to understand and predict human decision-making in transportation systems with the goal of improving efficiency, equity, and sustainability in urban mobility. She grew up here in Davis, so we will ask a question about that. Since we have a hometown gal with us today. But then she left us here in Davis to go to Berkeley for her undergrad, and then her master's and PhD at MIT, all in civil engineering. So for the civil engineering part of the crowd, she's the recipient of many awards. I like to tell this part, including the Institute of Transportation Studies Faculty of the Year, the Zephyr Leadership Award, and we will talk about what Zephyr is a little bit, and both an NSF Career and a PCASE Award, which is a very, very high honor. So we are very honored to have Joan here with us. And instead of a talk, what Joan asked for, since she gave the talk yesterday, I offered. For those of you who don't know, I've seen Dan do this quite a few times, and I really like the style. We call this a fireside chat. We have no fireplace, but the point is to have it be a casual conversation. I have some questions for Joan so no slides this week, none of that. We're gonna talk about Joan's career and things that she's been doing. I can sit down now because I got their attention. And then I will open it up to you guys. And so think of this as an opportunity for those of you who are familiar with Joan's work. You're welcome to ask questions about those things, but you're also welcome, and she's been very generous with the kinds of questions. If you guys want to talk about career path things, and I'll prompt some of those questions that might spark something as well. So that is how this is going to work. Let's welcome Joan. I'm going to go to my questions. So do you want to start off, just for anybody who wasn't in the room yesterday, telling us, kind of briefly about what your talk yesterday was about that they might have missed?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to kind of see all of you. Great to be here. I just, it's such a great environment here. Love eating lunch with the students, hearing all the great stuff you're doing, and it gives me all sorts of hope, which is helpful right now. Let's see, the talk last night. I've been, in academia, we tend to do these research projects. We do this. I was a very technical person. I did technical models. I produced papers. I get citations. And I think at this stage in my career, I'm starting to feel a little bit, I don't know, concerned or frustrated with this state of research, basically, and how, I have a chart that shows the number of publications over time, and it's basically an exponential growth, particularly over the last 10, 20 years. And when I look at that exponential growth, I'm thinking, are we getting exponential knowledge? Like, what are we getting out of all these papers? And feeling like that there's something about our research practices and the research enterprise that isn't producing as much knowledge as we could, and trying to rethink that. And I have to say, at this moment, last night I was very critical about the research enterprise. I want to say, I think the universities in this country are one of our shining examples. Now I'm going to get emotional. A shining example of what is great about this country. I think the attack on the universities is appalling. And so I think that we've done a lot of great work. We've done a lot of great research. My message in terms of the research enterprise is that if we could just coordinate a little bit more, we're a little bit, but we're about being bespoke. It's like, what's our unique spin on something? We put out our unique spin. There isn't a lot of, in our field, a lot of direct comparisons, and trying to learn maybe from some other fields that have very strong open data, open code and things like that practices, other fields that have strong benchmarking practices. And if we could think about how to shift it's all about I do behavior. So really it is still research, right? Because I used to do research on travel behavior, and now I'm kind of doing behavioral research on our as researchers and what our incentives are and how those incentives are playing through too. Anyway, did that summarize it?
That's great. I would just emphasize some of what I felt the outcomes were from that we talked about. We do well here in Davis, is actually opening up our data sets, making sure that when we produce research that we're summarizing things and producing policy briefs so that people know how to use the research we've produced. And this is part of what we're known for, but I think Joan had some great other suggestions of things that we could do to make sure we're doing that. And I think in where we are right now, research for research sake needs to go away.
Yeah.
And making sure that we have usable policy outcomes from our research is even more critical today than it's ever been before. So we are happy to take questions about any of that later if folks want to ask. I want to start at the beginning. You grew up in Davis. Tell your hometown crowd more about living in Davis in those days and how you think your core in a place that we think is pretty magical. At least I think it's pretty magical. I see some nodding around the table. How that might have influenced the rest of your career.
Yeah, so I moved here when I was 3. I was born in Concord. My dad was working for the state, and so my parents grew up in Sacramento, and they didn't want to go quite so close to home, so they ended up in Davis, and we had this, so me and my 3 siblings grew up here. Went through K through 12 here, and my parents weren't at the university, weren't affiliated with the university, but most of my parents' friends were, and most of my friends' parents were, and so I grew up really in this university environment. I tell this story, which is that I was an athlete, I did sports and stuff, and at the games that often the professor parents, which at that time were mostly male, they were around at the games. My dad was too, because my dad had his own business, and so he had that flexibility that a professor has. And so that these things I just kind of noticed growing up. And then my dad, who again had the flexibility but also ran his own business, he was kind of like, the job of a professor looks pretty darn good. So I had that in my head, and just growing up in, when you grow up in Davis, the university is so central, even if you're not directly affiliated. It's just this idea of an academic world where people are trying to, educate and do research, and I think it was really influential. And then growing up in this bike city also, even though now I tend to defend cars more because just to be a little bit of a devil's advocate. But growing up in a bike city and and then leaving here and realizing, whoa, everything's not like this, right?
Yeah. So after your time at Davis, you did your undergrad, and then you eventually went on to do a PhD. I feel like I have a question in there somewhere. The one I was going to go with is that you joined the faculty at Boston University in 2004 and then Berkeley in 2008. Oh, but prior to that, after your undergrad, maybe your master's was in there first, you actually worked in demand modeling at Caliper prior to your PhD. And then after your PhD, rather than going straight into faculty, you actually were their director, I think it was director of demand modeling. So we have a lot of people in the TTP program who are not headed for a PhD. They really want to go into industry. And we also have a lot of people who sort of question, do they want to end up in industry? Do they want to end up in academia? So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience in industry. Maybe, why you decided eventually to go into academia, and other things about sort of parallels between the two.
Okay, yeah, gosh, good question. So after my PhD, I looked around and I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I'd pretty much gone straight through. I had a 6-month stint between undergrad and master's where I worked. And I think I just wanted to explore industry a little bit, and also getting an academic job is hard. And at that point, I wasn't willing to go anywhere. So I did interview. Oh my gosh, I got a job at Purdue actually, and I turned it down. Yeah, because, God, and maybe I won't go into that. But,
No offense.
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it was that people told me at the time, if you turn that down, you're basically turning down academia. But there were just personal things going on that made it not the right choice for me then. And that's partly, so again, I was told by, my people who are giving me advice, okay, so you're giving up on academia. And I don't know, obviously I didn't, and I didn't, and so be careful about what you're told and what you're told to do. You have to kind of go with your instinct. So, and then I think I interviewed at one or two other places and didn't get them. And then I thought, well, I'll try industry. And I went to a company, Caliper Corporation. It had a lot of people with PhDs. It had this consulting side, but it also had this very research side. So it was just a really neat environment. And so neat that when I went back to my PhD and then came out again, I actually went and worked for them for 2 more years. When I left the second time, they're like, we're not going to let you come back the third time. But anyway, the first 2 years were transformational for sure. One of the things I think in our environments, our academic environments, we don't learn things that are super practical, right? Like I didn't know what the 4-step model was, and I was a demand modeler. And so you go to Caliper and I learned all this stuff, and it's great because you can pick it up quickly. So that's not a problem. So, but there's a steep learning curve where I just learned all this stuff that actually influences me today. Like having that knowledge as an academic, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have this very practical piece. I think it's critical to the way I approach things. And then I went back afterwards, and the learning curve wasn't as steep, right? I had learned a lot of this stuff. I felt like, even though it was a fabulous place, it's more on the consulting side. When you can do things repetitively, that's how, you kind of learn to do something well and you keep doing it. And that's what makes it valuable, even though it was a fabulous place. And then so then I decided, okay, I'm going to go out on the market. And I decided that actually I was going to go where the job was. I wasn't going to do this Purdue thing again, where I was like, I don't really want to be in Purdue. And then this job at Boston University actually kind of fell in my lap before it came up. Someone reached out to me. I interviewed. It was in geography. It was with geographers. And so I went there, and I actually loved being at Boston University. I really liked the department. I was happy there. And then the job came up at Berkeley, and actually I thought at the time that I would come to Davis, but the Davis offer didn't come. And, because I was trying to get back to, I was always trying to get back to California. It took me 18 years to get back. And so then this job came up at Berkeley, and I just bought a house. I just had a kid. I put the house on the market. I picked up my kid and got on the plane and came out here and haven't looked back. But that industry experience, I think it's, as an academic, you have to figure out how to get that somehow. It can either be working there, or it can be to kind of just working closer with industry and things, but it's, did I answer all your questions?
You did, you absolutely did.
This fireside chat thing is wild.
So many academics, now to your career at Berkeley, right? Sort of, many academics either focus on methods or do sort of more applied side research. You have a solid grounding in both. You've published in both, and have been productive in both areas. Can you tell us more about how you see sort of striking that balance, that we're furthering our field methodologically, but that we're also making sure, as you talked about yesterday, that policy outcomes come out of the things that we're doing?
Gosh, well, I'm glad. I mean, thank you for that. I feel like I've always been a little bit more stronger methodologically, and even I was telling you, some of my data sets, I tend to use kind of convenient data sets and convenient samples because I need the data, and it's very expensive to get and I've always kind of leaned on that methodological, well, I'm just doing methods, right? I'm trying to develop methods. It's not as important. So, but I think it's my desire, that desire I have to not do research for research sake, but to have some impact. So I think that's gotten me pulled more towards the policy side. We were talking earlier at lunch that, in the methodological journals, there's a certain paper that we'll get in these journals, and it's a very kind of, you have to do a methodological twist on something that isn't always that interesting, right? But it's somehow technically challenging, and I have trouble going there, you know, it doesn't excite me to do that. I need to be driven by some, you know, some end that's other than just a methodological twist, so maybe that's it.
So what do you then consider your most impactful work in your career thus far?
Oh my gosh.
I told you I was gonna ask hard questions.
What do you
For everyone here, I gave her a chance to
I know.
prepare ahead of time, and she said she wanted to wing it, so.
You know, I mean, I think that when I started, I was working on choice models, and again, I was always looking at them and saying, there's something about them that's not very satisfying. There's not very behavioral. I was really interested in the behavior and trying to look at the choice model in a way that can capture behavior and being able to specify and estimate it flexibly, I think. And it's how I think at lunch, someone asked me a question, what should you do in a choice model? But how should we get into choice models or do choice modeling? And I was like, well, you always need to start with the behavior first, you know, think about the behavior, what's interesting about the behavior, what's driving it before you even think about the math and think about what the question is. But and then having a choice model that can be so flexible that it can really capture any complex behavioral thing you're interested in. So I suspect that's what I'm most known for. Yeah, things like
Is that what you're most proud of too?
What am I most proud of?
Or, I mean, because impact could be what you're known for, but
Yeah.
impact could also be the thing that
Well,
means the most to you, that you feel like.
I find it interesting that I'm quite well known for ICLV, the Integrated Choice and Late Variable Model. I noticed David Bunch, I think, sells it up here, which is a lot, but the paper he makes you all read is this Vidge and Walker paper, and I'm very proud of that because the ICLV, it's a classic example where it's a fancy model, it's hard to estimate, it takes more data to estimate it, and I feel like there was this, people got really excited about it and they were using it just to use it, and I kept looking at the results saying, you went through all this work, and you're like, what do you have, you know, what did it do for you? It has to, if you're gonna do this really complex thing, you would hope you'll get something out of it that's worth that complexity. And so I think I'm proud of that. Like, not like I could have written 1,000 ICLV papers that just, you know, I could churn them out like,
Yeah.
And just to step back and say, no, you know, you want to use the ICLV when it's necessary and useful. There was also, I think, just the carefulness of, you know, the ICLV, people are coming out and kept saying, oh, well, it's fitting the model better. Well, it turns out, you know, mathematically, it actually doesn't fit better. It can't fit better, or maybe marginally, but because of the way the structure works. And so kind of recognizing that, well, if it's not fitting the data better, what is it doing for you? So that kind of pausing and saying, well, what do we really have here? That I'm proud of, you know.
Yeah, I agree. So at lunch, maybe this is not as good a question as I originally thought when I wrote it, because I know that you've done at least some work in the developing world. You kind of played that down a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about that. In particular, because we have this new Global South Center that we're launching, and we're starting to do more and more work in the developing world. So I was curious if you could tell us more about work you had done and sort of any advice or lessons learned in the process.
Yeah, I've done some. I haven't done that much, and the stuff I do, I think I was always, so my work's really data intensive, and I was always kind of up against the wall of that data piece. And so I think that's and I've never really gone to collect data in the Global South, and I think that really for me to do more fundamental work there, I would have to actually go and collect data there and also just engage in a way that I just don't think you can do that work from here. You know,
I totally agree.
Yeah. So I think what I've done in that area is, like, I was trying to dabble in it and I was interested in getting into it, but I never really took that leap to do it. But I think I'd love to, you know, I'd love to. It's just that somehow the career path didn't take me there, right?
So all our Global South folks, including my own, you heard her say it here, that if we go and collect the data, she's willing to help us
I
do the
would love
modeling. So.
Because that's what I need, because I don't have the energy to go collect the data. But I would love to be involved.
Yeah.
That's
Awesome. We will take you up on that, Joan.
You all will get me in the Global South.
There you
Yeah,
go.
doing real work.
So you were one of the co-founders of the Zephyr Foundation. So turning to that sort of idea, which is a nonprofit working, for those of you who don't know, working to advance travel analysis to improve society. I have come across the Zephyr Foundation quite a bit in my work, and I know several of your co-founders. But I wondered if you could just tell, and I'm guessing most people in the room have never heard of Zephyr Foundation. I wanted to give you a chance to kind of plug it and talk about like why you guys started in the first place and what kind of role you think Zephyr should be playing.
Yeah, and it came out from the same, similar to my talk last night, trying to figure out, is research leading to impact and how can we do it better? So I've been on this path for a long time. And I had a NSF grant before the pandemic where we ran a whole workshop trying to figure out how to advance the science. I was the chair of the Travel Demand Forecasting Committee at TRB, and that I had this theme the whole time trying to figure out how can we do things differently. And so when I was chair at TRB, we kept trying to do things about advancing the science, and kind of there's been this division between academia and practice, I think, in the modeling world, and trying to figure out how to bring that together a little bit more and really advance the science for, policy analysis and planning. So there was this effort in the committee that was happening. There was also this parallel effort from people like Elizabeth Saul and David Ory and other people that ended up. And so we were just kind of brainstorming, and we realized that we needed another type, TRB wasn't quite serving the role. There weren't things that were quite serving the role that had this objective focus of trying to advance the science of travel demand modeling, travel analysis for real world applications. So that's how it came about, and that's what the Zephyr organization is doing. So I was talking about open science. In fact, last night, if you noticed, they have a committee on open science. They're trying to get these open science practices. They have badges for things. Then should I talk about the reality of it?
Sure.
So I think actually, like right now I'm chair of the department, I have my hands full, but I think when I'm done with that, I actually really want to focus more on things like Zephyr. So Zephyr, I feel like it's really taken off well in the practice side of it. There's really, the MPOs have come together. They're trying to get more generalized models and more practices that are, but the academics haven't engaged that much. There's something about the academics, again, what's our currency? Our currency is publications in these top journals. That's not necessarily in line with the Zephyr. The Zephyr has to be this really, coming from within, that you really want to connect with practice, you want to. And again, there's a trade-off. If you want to do that stuff in the academic world, it's really not valued that much is kind of the bottom line. And so it's a trade-off, right? You'll have fewer papers if you do these things. And so trying to figure out, but I just haven't had time to give attention to that piece of it. I love Zephyr. They're some of my favorite people because they have this strong desire to, really develop analysis that does good, and they're really trying hard and and I am involved some, but not as much as their student memberships.
And they usually meet at TRB, like how would people get involved if they wanted to get involved with Zephyr?
Yeah, so there's first of all, there are some subcommittees that I'm sure if you want to volunteer on, you're certainly welcome to volunteer. And then there's a membership, which is a little, I think for students, it's very cheap. And then there's a TRB, although I don't know what's happening at TRB. I don't know, but at TRB, there's a meeting every year. I think there's both a meeting as well as a kind of a social event. And there's this conference, MOMO, coming up.
What is MoMA? Can you tell us? Okay, it's okay if you can.
No.
We can look it up.
Yeah, but it's a conference that they're trying to do about, new mobility and models and analytics for, and they're actually trying to get more academics to be
Okay.
involved and.
But it's like
just-
bringing new mobility into the
I think
demand
so,
forecasting
yeah.
practice? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
that-
For those of you, and many of you have taken Miguel's class, learned about the four-step model and some of the things that we're talking about. This is one of the things notoriously that models are not always good at. It's looking at sort of, as our transportation world changes, how do we actually estimate how many people are gonna take new roads or how these might change. So, case of things. Good, the only other thing, I was trying to come up with a good question and I couldn't. You're now the chair of civil and environmental engineering. We talked a bit yesterday about that I was surprised when you took on this role of chair of the department. So do you want to talk more about sort of that administrative side of your
Yeah.
duties? Any things that
I don't know, I have to say, I'm kind of surprised I'm chair, I never really had a desire to be chair, I feel like people have often asked me to lead things and I'm like, I don't really want to, but I think when chair came around, and actually, my experience at Institute of Transportation Studies is similar, like it came up and I was like, I don't think I really want to do that now, maybe later, but later doesn't come a little bit. So then this chair thing came up, someone needs to be chair. Often the people who want to be chair aren't the people who want to be chair. And so, and I think I was kind of willing to do it. And it's just a whole different set of challenges for sure. It's interacting with people, the students and the faculty in a different way that I've actually really enjoyed. It's just like here, it's a community you're really proud of, right? It's really good people trying to do smart people, trying to do good work, working on important problems. And to help, it's really as an enabler. Actually, so in high school, you have to take those surveys to figure out what career may be good for you. I did this at Davis High and it said like counselor. And I thought, I was a math and science kid. And I was like, counselor, that's odd. And now as chair, I realize that's what I am. It's really about managing these, kind of strong personalities. Lots of students. We have the community at Berkeley is 1,000 people, so around I think 800 students, and then the faculty and staff and all this stuff. So it's really kind of trying to manage and keep everyone going and going in a positive direction, doing good things, enabling people to do things. And as a chair, you can enable people, right? You can really help people and help groups try to achieve what they're trying to achieve. And I'm enjoying it. It's just a whole different set of challenges. So I think as an academic, right, as students, you're always trying to do something new, right? You're trying to do, and so I think that's as an academic in my nature, in our nature, it's that we thrive on that. If we've already done it, it's not very interesting. So for me, it's like another challenge that.
So we all have ADHD, we all have
Totally.
Right. Only we focus in 3-year chunks, and then after that, we're done. We want to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, but I don't have any desire to move to another. Everyone's like, what are you gonna do after chair? I'm like, sabbatical, but I do think of like Zephyr. I do think they're trying to lean into that more.
Yeah. True. Well, I want to open things up to see what questions you guys might have for Joan. Yeah.
I actually had a specific question about, so both of you have a lot of industry experience with our
Yeah, good, well done.
before we're getting into academia, and I was actually going to ask about like the crisis that you see within our current publication, like our literature, like the size of the literature system. So how do you think that also affects other people trying to go from industry into academia? Do you think it's harder? Has it been getting harder over time? That's like what I've been thinking from what I've seen, but I couldn't be too sure.
So you're saying somebody like who got a PhD and then they go into industry for a while and then they want to change to go into academia? What exactly are you saying? Okay.
Sure, yeah, that's like the one situation I'm thinking about. It's like going back into academia seems to be very difficult because of the currency being publications and such.
Yeah.
I mean, even when I went into industry, I kind of knew that if I wanted to do academia, which I was thinking about, there was a limited time. It's not like I could go into industry for years. I thought, a couple years and then I should make a decision. So one thing is, I think industry is really valuable when we're looking at candidates. It's helpful for someone who's had some experience, and especially like these, tech firms or with data, they have access to data and access to contacts and things that are super valuable. So I think that's considered valuable. The thing is, you do have to keep your publications. You have to make sure to publish your PhD and at least have enough public. And that's the thing I hate to, after turning around and saying we're publishing too much, there's the reality of the situation. But don't just churn out papers, but just kind of, if you go into industry, just try to make sure to keep engaged with that publication piece. But I think it's great. I think I would be a much worse academic if I hadn't had those 4 years in industry. It's
I did it the opposite way, where I was in industry for much longer than most academics before I got my PhD. And so I think that you sort of avoid that problem, except that you make really good money in industry, and then it's really hard to become a PhD student. So that's the downside of that path. But I mean, that's how I've gotten many faculty positions. I've had two, but I think it played a part in both of them was because I actually was a professional engineer before I got my PhD. And so I teach senior design, for those of you who don't know, who haven't.
Which is good for
I am the VPE. Sometimes it feels like there's usually a couple of us, but there are not many of us who, for those of you who really want to be an academic, but you're not sure how you're going to sell yourself, having a PE and then going into academia, because ABET requires us to have a PE teaching senior design. It's a really great way to have some job security wherever you go. So.
There's a question.
Yeah.
I was gonna stand up so I can see you. Hi, Joan. Just wanted to mention Vijay Walker is like one of the celebrity papers here. We've all read it several times. I try to understand every time I feel like I'm reading a new thing because it's complicated. But I had a similar question to Matt, except that I'm more curious about like academia and policy rather than industry. I don't know if industry includes like state governments and stuff like that, or if you were talking about like private firms. But like I'm kind of curious about how you think, even in being in academia, how can we keep in touch with like policy? Like what are your tips on that? And like what are your ways of like contributing there and kind of knowing what's going on? And
you're asking me. I mean, Davis is phenomenal.
It is, yeah.
Right. So I would look to the faculty here and see how they operate and who they interact with and how they're engaged with policies. I think that's a really, phenomenal aspect of this program that I don't see as strongly at Berkeley. I mean, there is contacts, but not that. I mean, I think here it's this real partnership in a way. It's that is great. So I would pass that to Carrie.
These guys get to hear me talk all the time. So let me prompt something that I just learned the other day, that you were involved in a review of the high-speed rail modeling efforts at one point in time. I feel like that was very policy focused.
Yeah.
You made a grimace. Maybe I'm bringing up about it.
I've never done a lot of consulting because I don't have time really, but I do things like when I'm asked to do things and I think, oh, that's a value for me to understand what's going on. So I was, and that's Carlos Giordano, who he was the modeler I was working with, who's now working with me as a PhD student. So what, I find those advising roles, it's hard to impact it a lot, I find, as an advisor. I mean, you would really have to be quite aggressive in a way that I feel like I don't have the energy for. I think some people do. Mm-hmm. So I think that's maybe why I grimace. So sure, I was reviewing the models, I was giving them feedback on things. I would, they would come and ask me questions and I would say, well, I think you should do this, or you should look into that, or you should look into this literature. And but the forecast, it was a pretty basic basic forecast, a basic stated preference design that had, it had some issues, now I can't remember what it is, had some issues, but to solve those issues is like, it's a research project. And so working in the consulting world, it's a little bit different, so. Or getting them beyond, it's not like you can put advanced models in there or anything, but even kind of getting them to late class choice model, which I love, you keep talking about ICLV, I love the late class choice model because it's, but anyway, for various reasons, it's, I think it really gives you about market segmentation. It's very behavioral. You find out that there are different markets that kind of are looking at making their choices differently in certain ways that, and I think for high-speed rail, that would be phenomenal, right? Because I think that this lifestyle choice, I mean, this is, and that's what I should have mentioned, my impact. I mean, that's the work. Vidge, by the way, Vidge, that Vidge and Walker paper, Vidge is phenomenal, I mean, so, but this idea of lifestyle decisions that I feel like we do all this behavioral modeling, but we make a lifestyle decision that actually from that, all of our travel decisions are conditional on it. And so it's really, if we want to change behavior, anything, it needs to be at that lifestyle level. And this model, which was Vidge's dissertation, which was phenomenal, and but that's,
there are people smiling in the audience because we're working, literally that's Maha's PhD, is use ICLV with rail data to understand different markets and we're working with high-speed rail right now with one of your former students who I can't remember his name, Justin something. He was a master's student, he didn't do a PhD, but to look at their current modeling practices, so maybe we'll rope you back into some of those things too. Sure. He seems ready to be doing more advanced models, but because I think there's a lot of unknowns. Something like high-speed rail, understanding how many people, when this is so groundbreaking in our state, how many people would actually use this once it's constructed, like it's anybody's guess what that actual number is, so we can do all kinds of models to try, and one day somebody's gonna be right who is at the top of one of those models, hopefully.
And all this fundamentally new stuff, which I mean, you wouldn't think high-speed rail would be so fundamentally new, but it is. We don't have a rail culture. And the question is, can we get a rail culture? And that rail culture is gonna come through lifestyle and kind of, it's really about their choice set. Like, are people considering this in some way? Autonomous vehicle, same thing. It's.
Other questions?
I'm curious, as someone who grew up on the East Coast and now is doing my graduate studies on the West Coast, you did the opposite. I'm curious to hear what you learned kind of from the different places you've lived, or like what did you notice about living in Boston that surprised you maybe transportation wise?
Yeah, so I mean, Boston is way more of a transit city. California, it's to live your life in transit out here, this is where I tend to be the devil's advocate with the transportation students who advocate so much for, non-auto lifestyles.
Right.
Here, California, the auto lifestyle is just too easy and the alternatives just aren't good enough. Whereas Boston, I feel like, it was really a service that, I was there years without a car. As an undergrad at Berkeley, I had access to a car. It wasn't, my brother was there too, so we shared it, but so that's totally different. So having that, I spent sabbatical in Paris for a year recently, and even my son was like, Mom, you love, he was fifth grader then, he's like, you love the Paris Metro, but you hate BART, why is that? So then I just went bam, 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 but it's like, and so, how we get that type of transit here, and I mean, I think the only way, this congestion pricing model where you can come up with money to improve, you have to make driving harder and you have to make the alternatives better and transit better. Like all these advocates here, at least my colleagues at Berkeley are in this space, we're not riding transit. We're biking, we're walking, and then we're driving some. We're not on the transit system. No. And so we're living, where we can live close to campus. So it's like, how do we get, if we're not riding transit? Anyway, so that's kind of negative.
But it's reality.
Right.
And for those of us who do this kind of work, like keeping that in mind that, sometimes if we're too big of an advocate, we make illogical choices, and we're not following the choice model, and you can't expect that someone making rational choices is gonna do the same thing.
And behaviorally, that's one thing, and all of us fall into it, is that, when you do behavioral research and behavioral modeling, it's so hard to think about something who doesn't think like you. Actually, we see it in the country now, right? I mean, it's like, how to really understand, and if you're trying to do something in the world and trying to do policy, you have got to understand what these people are who aren't thinking like you, because it's kind of easy to convince people in this room of this stuff, right? But I was talking about congestion pricing in San Francisco. I'm living in San Francisco now, and they study congestion pricing every few years, and they just did it recently. Then I saw this news story, and both the reporters and the people they talked to, they were all just like, why would we ever want to do that? It's just like it was the most evil thing. There wasn't a single inkling of how this could maybe take us to a different space, or how it could transform the region, and what the economics of congestion pricing, and and of course dealing with what are we doing? It's affordable, considering with the affordability aspects.
Other questions?
Yeah, thank you for your discussion today. You might have gone over this yesterday, so I apologize.
No
if this is
problem.
a little redundant, but I just wanted to ask, how do we make sure that research is applicable to policy without merely being like reactionary or responding to existing problems rather than anticipating future
Gosh. It's a good question, you can answer. I mean, I think partly this is this current academic treadmill we're on, that we're just, the currency is papers, and we're trying to churn out papers as fast as we can. And I think it's hard to do slow and thoughtful research. And I think that there's a book, Slow Professor, which was a really popular book about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but it's a really powerful book. It kind of says that the point of a university and university research is to do this slow and thoughtful thinking. This quick cycle of things is really more like industry. And so somehow figuring out how to slow down a little bit and not, and really ask yourself, when you're doing your research, ask yourself that question. Are you living up to this ideal that you want to? And you probably you can't just shift to that ideal, but you can at least question yourself and see if you can kind of move in that direction, do something that gets you there. So I guess that's it. You're already being thoughtful about it, and just stop and take a breath every once in a while.
Thank you.
Oh,
There we
no.
go. I was waiting for Dan's question.
No, it's not a question, but to help respond.
Oh, you're gonna
Oh, yeah.
respond. Okay, go for it.
I think a lot of it is just following what's happening in the real world, reading newsletters, even the newspaper,
Yeah. Mhm.
Economist magazine, and seeing what are people worried about. And then coming back and saying, do we really know the answer? And in many cases, the answer, it's no, we don't know the answer. When you talk about new mobility or high-speed rail, heck, we've been doing this for years, and yet we don't really have a good understanding even now. A lot of it is kind of what you said earlier, a lot of it is different settings, different situations, technology evolves, policy evolves. And so that's what I would just say, paying attention to the real world. However you do it, talking to people.
Yeah, that's a great response. It makes me reminded that I think some of the best students I've had are the ones who are just so inquisitive. They read a lot from a lot of different places. They engage with people in a way that they're just always trying to figure out what someone's about and what's they're thinking and what they're working on. And so just that general inquisitive nature of trying to get everything.
Other questions?
Yes, just a really old anecdote about the question on lifestyle in the East Coast and the West Coast. That kind of like touch your history with Solomon and Ben Akiva walked on lifestyle And that's kind of, I think, almost the starting point of that.
Totally.
So one of Elon's committee members said that lifestyle is something happened on the West Coast, nothing to do with the East Coast. They don't have it, you know.
Who said that, do you know?
I
Someone-
don't remember who are the other two members of his committee where I can't remember. One of, not Ben Akiva, one of the other two.
I can
members.
ask you, I wonder if you remember.
Yeah, if you remember, who are that? Yeah, just to remind me this whole story.
Yeah.
But I'm going back to this really tough question of like external validity in matter of like policy of making a change. And I will feel a bit of a devil advocate thinking that a lot of our work today on the modeling is we are not even producing elasticities anymore.
Yeah.
So we almost become qualitative in our work.
Uh-huh.
Why? Where do we take it from here?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I had, during the pandemic, I was teaching and the SSCTA was working on their congestion pricing. They were gonna implement it and I knew that they'd used their, or MTC, I can't remember if it was anyway, one of those agencies, and I knew they'd used their model for congestion pricing for this, there was this big policy and all this stuff. And so I was like, oh, great, I'm gonna have them come in, I'm gonna have them talk to my students about how they use their model for congestion pricing. And they came in, it was over the pandemic, you know, we were all just, it was the first shutdown, I think the first semester where it was, we were all in chaos and then they described what they did. And I was just so confused because I was like, well, what, you know, they used the model in such a limited way. I mean, it was so, they hardly did anything. And finally I pulled it out of them, but that because it was so political, they were literally asked one and only one question, which is, what does the price need to be to take the traffic down to this level? And they calculated that one value. And because I had been telling the students, oh, in these simulators, you can look at equity, you can look at long-term thing, you can look at all these, you know, spatial impacts and, you know, modal impacts, and they didn't do any of that. And so it's, you know, this disconnect between kind of what these models can do and really what they're used for. And so I think maybe that's partly what's been driving me. I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, we're not doing it. And so, and why we aren't calculating elasticity, so I don't know. I mean, you know, I think really we need to do a better job of, you know, testing and developing our models in a way. And
I was just smiling in hope because calculating elasticities,
yeah.
but it's because we have a client that they're like, this is what we need to come out of this research. And so
Yeah.
then you do, right? When that's who's
Yeah.
funding you is somebody, and so that's a lot of what comes out of the partnerships that we have at Davis, where we do
Yeah.
a lot of this policy relevant work. If you have a funder who's telling you I need an elasticity, you're gonna create an elasticity. So.
And I wonder if there's this idea of North Stars also, like if there are things that we should be calculating, you know, it shouldn't just be one person calculating, it should be, you know, it's like if there's something that's really important that we should measure, why aren't we all kind of working on it? But again, it's not the way a researcher mind works, right? A researcher mind is like, what interesting thing am I gonna do? As opposed to having a stronger collaborative effort to answer really the really important question could be, you know, what is the impact of, you know, what's the ridership on high-speed rail gonna be? That's a really hard question. You know, if you could get 20 different researchers to try to figure out that question, it would be interesting, right? We're at least asking 20 different researchers how they think we should be modeling what the ridership on high-speed rail is. Yeah. What other questions do you guys have for Joan? Young, so.
Yeah, I have a little personal question at my level. So yeah, please bear with me selfish. So I wonder what you can advise early career researchers in terms of dealing with challenges. I assume when you were some years ago when you were early career researchers, faculty, you also had to deal with challenges back then. And now some of the challenges we are facing is exactly kind of related to your comments or your lecture yesterday. Like there is really quick turnaround of papers. Some people make joke about like paper mills or
Yeah.
paper gangs or citation gangs.
Yeah.
And there's also kind of like unfulfilled like desire to do something very critical. So not necessarily directly changing the world, but somehow change the way we see the problems, like somehow contribute to the literature or the field in a very important ways. So there are at least many challenges, of course, funding challenges, and of course how to better manage or better help students, all sorts of challenges. But one thing I see is that the balance between these two, like I cannot completely ignore about number while focusing on quality because I cannot guarantee my quality next year or 2 years later. So
Yeah.
how do I know right now? So how can you advise on this?
Oh, I know, it's so awful because the currency is publications and citations, right? So, I mean, so you do have to worry about it. I
Yeah.
can't say you don't worry about it, but I don't think you have to churn out. I think churning out papers isn't gonna do you any good. If you can't point to them and say, this is what's really interesting about them, and this is why my research is interesting, I just don't think it's gonna, I hope, I don't know. That's my idealistic view of the world, that people actually read the papers, but, so it's really just a balance. But I would say, if your mentality is, and I don't think yours is, but a mentality that's just trying to figure out what the next paper is, what's the idea that I can turn into a paper? I don't think that's gonna get you anywhere. So you have to stop and you have to be proud of your work and think, at least this is something that I wanna put out. Sometimes that means not doing something that you think could be an easy paper because it doesn't feel important. So it's just, you're gonna have to make choices on what you work on. And as you make those choices, just try to be mindful about and maybe sometimes you do have to do things just to get a paper. Some of those, maybe you have to do that. It's like you need numbers, but it used to be like when I got tenure, we needed 2 or 3 papers a year. I mean, now, what are people publishing? Yeah,
Most of our PhD applicants this year had 3 or 4 papers.
yeah, just the applicants,
The applicants.
yeah. And we're talking about high school students now are
Yeah.
publishing papers.
Mhm.
Yeah, and actually, when Susan was talking about some, that there are all these undergrad researchers here and they have a poster session and I think that's great, right? It's like, have people get research, have a great poster session, engage in that way, to turn all those into papers. It's, but I don't know what to do because then they won't get the PhD program if they don't turn it into a paper, right?
Not in my case.
Yeah.
We've had some interesting discussions here recently about kind of this like disconnect in universities and with people in the general American public who are supportive of the kind of funding withdrawal of university and kind of attacks on universities we've been seeing in the past few months. And I'm curious on what you think we can do to kind of better bridge that gap. Like, I think as someone who also believes in research and its ability to, advance the public good, how can we convince people who are skeptical or distrustful of universities and of research?
Oh my gosh. That's a hard question. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, how do you, the problem is there's such a divide. I mean, and if you look, I don't know, like, I try to make sure to read newspapers on both sides because you start to see we're in our bubbles. And like, I know at Berkeley, I'm in a bubble. And we're all reading the same stuff, we're thinking the same way, we're doing the same thing mostly. And so I think one thing is to really understand it and be open that they, if you're having a conversation, it's hard, but to be open that they're not necessarily coming from an evil place, they're so to try to be able to converse in a way that, Karen Frick at Berkeley, I don't know if you know her, she's in planning, but she studies people on the political spectrum, and it's just fascinating work. So I've learned a lot from her about, where, trying to understand where people are coming from and what's driving them, and trying to be more open to it, not just thinking you're an idiot or, whatever. So that piece I can give, but what actually to do, I mean, one thing I know, like Berkeley and Davis and people, the top people are trying to go to Washington and saying, look, this is what the universities are doing, and these are the things, this is the contribution we make on the research side. And so I think that helps, just trying to, have some things about what research does here. I think, to me, our university system is like, the best in the world. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's, to take down our university system, to take down Harvard, does that make sense? So,
Or the UC.
yeah, I mean, in California, like, I think our public school system, that when you look at the community colleges, the state colleges and the UCs, this is like a gem to protect it. So, but also to understand that even like I'm critical of research, there are inefficiencies, there are ways we can be better. So kind of, yeah. Do other people have ideas of how to make the case?
I think you hit the nail on the head, that like listening to what the concerns are that underlie something.
Yeah.
Like sometimes when views are so in opposition to your own, your natural reaction is like, to fight, right?
Yeah.
Like, but then I think eventually you get to the point where like you take a step back and you think about where that critique is coming from and how do we make ourselves better based on listening to what's underlying that critique. So to me, like, you heard Joan self-censor with a couple of words that she said. And I mean, if there's a problem using a word like equity and we suddenly start thinking, well, what do we really mean by this? Like what word that we're putting in place is really what we meant in the first place, right? That like within ITS, we have a DEI committee that is now, I'm not gonna get the name right, but community, what is it, Young Sun?
It's not
Something,
decided.
principles of community. And if you read our principles of community, I don't think anybody could be against the things that we put in our principles of community. And so we've taken a step back from this coding and thought about, well, what is the actual underlying value beneath all of these things? And I think when we do that through our research, through, any sort of policy work that we're trying to do, like when you think about the actual value, like maybe it's good for Gil to all of a sudden have people questioning, like, are EVs the most sustainable way that we go about this? Maybe, we've been taking this for granted, and when you start doing underlying work, like, maybe we're right, but maybe we'll slightly divert in a way that actually makes that even better, instead of like cramming a solution in there that is maybe not the best.
Yeah, it's true, the bubble is also about the way we think about research, right?
Yeah.
And what,
Maybe just to kind of shoot back at the same thing, we are for 50 years trying to move people to transit. And maybe it's time to
We have to think differently
think
about
differently
these things,
about
right?
it. Think
If we
differently
keep
about
coming
it.
at the same problem over and over and over again with the same solution, and it's not changing things.
Or
Then we need to
congestion
think
pricing
differently.
when we kind of like
Yeah.
surprised that they
Yeah.
are saying.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to be, stop being surprised about like the reaction we get.
Is there any more questions out there? We can close out. If not, can we thank Joan? Oh, wait, Sampat's gonna get the last one. Go for it, Sampat.
Thank you for the discussion. My question is in the line of the core curriculum principle that Berkeley has. It has consistently been top ranked for years now. What according to you has been the secret sauce for Berkeley to be the top university for civil engineering? And what is that something that you see in Berkeley and you don't see in other places?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I don't know that I can talk about other places so much, although, I mean, MIT have a good, good understanding of what's, one thing about Berkeley is it's, for civil and environmental engineering, we've remained broad, we've remained committed to the different, aspects of civil and environmental engineering. So we actually have 7 programs, structures, environmental, geotech, and I think that decision is partly, we haven't, a lot of schools have kind of left, like, Stanford is really just environmental, MIT got rid of structures. And so I think that's it. I think it's, it really isn't, but I think Davis has this, but it really is a neat community of people who are very, have similar values, having, the being at a public university, right? We really have this public good and this public mission that I think is felt very strongly at Berkeley. And so it's this trying to improve, and I think it's just easier being at a place that people want to come to. It's a little bit easier, right? I mean, that's, there are places that, and again, I think Davis is similar, but, there's some places where people kind of go, and they go just thinking that it will take them somewhere else. And so being a place that people want to stay, the collaborative nature also, it's really, it's neat being on campus committees, for example, because the colleagues are just so interesting, right? So being in that environment of the university where there's so much great, the departments are all just really kind of phenomenal. They're people. So, but I don't know. Did I answer any secret sauce? But anyway,
We
I
dodged
see,
and weaved like a good
Well, but
share of a department.
no, but I feel like when I look at Davis, it has a lot of the similar qualities that I think are of such a value.
Yeah.
Phenomenal students who want to come and,
Absolutely. We absolutely have phenomenal students. So maybe that is where I'm gonna leave off, because we do have phenomenal students in the room. And so thank you again, Joan.